So Jan Karski is somebody that we should have talked about at some point already here on our show, but we have a chance to focus on him and his story thanks to a documentary that was recently added to Netflix. It's called Karski, Władcy Ludzkości, or Lords of Humanity. The documentary is in English with Polish subtitles, and I'll go ahead and tell you now that we all very strongly recommend it. If you live here in Poland, if you want to know more about its 20th century history, more about World War II, more about the Holocaust, you absolutely need to watch this. We'll get into the details in just a second, but first let's go through the just the broad strokes. Jan Karski was one of those guys who was going to be a huge success at whatever he did. Very bright, ambitious, movie star good looks. He joined the Polish diplomatic corps in the late 1930s, which, as we all know, was very bad timing. After the Nazi invasion of Poland, he was captured by the Russians, traded to the Gestapo, and he started this amazing journey during which he constantly cheated death, came face to face with some of the most shocking scenes of the Holocaust, moved around Europe like a spy, avoiding capture with the help of a secret underground network, met with Allied leaders in London and the American president in the White House. His mission was to inform the outside world about what was going on in Poland, Nazi-occupied Poland, specifically with regard to the Jewish population. And the documentary tells you what he did to gather that information and the surprising reception that he got in the halls of power. The documentary itself is a bit of a strange mashup of source materials, mostly consisting of a series of interviews that Karski gave in the 1980s, maybe one from the early 90s. Combined with a recent interview of the person who conducted those earlier interviews. It's got a lot of film footage and photographs taken from the time of the war, many of which are very hard to watch at times. We've all seen disturbing scenes from World War II, but there are some here that I'd never seen before, and they are really, really, as I said, difficult to watch. The documentary also has some animated sequences that help to illustrate some of the events that Karski describes during the interview. Guys, we all agree this is a must-watch, but what were your main takeaways from the documentary?
Which one of the guys?
Somebody step forward.
Well, I have to say, just from not talking about the actual material, but just the way the documentary was put together, the pacing, the imagery, it's one of those documentaries that nothing really happens, but the way to describe the history of it, is just so enthralling, and it can really suck you in. And it lasts it's just a little over an hour or so.
And Karski is a very compelling narrator of the story as well.
Exactly, yeah. And the interview, segments of interviews that were chosen for this, plus the imagery in between, I was basically glued to the screen for this. For sure. And in that sense, this is a perfectly made documentary. So, not only is the material, the subject matter is vitally important and interesting, but just the way that it's presented to the audience is also done, superbly well.
Even the way it starts is nice because he kind of introduces to us as this Georgetown professor who for 40 years has just quietly worked alongside his colleagues and not really discussed this much at all. And we find out later in the movie that's because he considered the reaction to his reports to be a bit of a failure, from the Western powers, and was something he was actually kind of ashamed of, the reaction, particularly from Roosevelt, which we'll get to later. But I found the documentary amazing. First of all, just to echo what Mike and yourself have said there, he himself is a fascinating interviewee. And that's a crucial plank to any good documentary for me. The person who's telling the story has to be compelling, has to really want to paint you a picture. And there's a very effective technique. You've mentioned the cartoons or the animation that accompanies the stock footage. And you're right, the stock footage, especially the Warsaw Ghetto, is really hard to watch. But what I enjoyed very much is the scenes, like the meeting with Roosevelt, are animated. So the narrative never loses its flow, and when it goes to the talking heads themselves stand up really well. I enjoyed a lot of the American colleagues from back in the States who are also historians chipping in, and overall, and in terms of a production and the way I like documentaries put together, absolutely first rate.
I also like to point out the fact that those moments where Karski is shown to actually just emotionally break down, he has trouble talking about things that happened
45 years ago,
and you can still see that it really haunted him, and this raw kind of emotion being presented here.
It's important to remember, I know we're jumping around here, but it's important to remember, and this is kind of mentioned at the beginning, I believe, after the war, Karski moves to America. He starts studies at Georgetown University, which, if you don't know, is kind of like the place where the American diplomats go to get their credentials. And he spends the next 40 years there as a professor and whatnot. without saying a word, or almost without saying a word, about his experiences during the war. And it was only thanks to a documentary released, I believe, by a French filmmaker in 1987 called Shoah, that interview, and the interview, that the footage that we see in this documentary that we're talking about, is most of it is taken from this other documentary. When it's broadcast in 1987, people who know Karski professionally and his ex-students, whatnot, they say, wait a second, he's never said a word about this. So he goes back to work the following day or week or whenever, and he gets this very, emotional, enthusiastic reception from these people who had no idea about his wartime experiences. And so, Mike, when you say that he gets really emotional, and he does when he's recounting these events, I think part of him, just to maybe cope with it, kind of locked it away, and maybe he had to, so he could move on with his life. And just now, these 45 years later, he was revisiting these memories for the first time.
Important to note that that's all true, but he was academically involved in documenting a lot of
Yeah. But in terms of his personal, what he saw.
Did you know Clinton was one of his students? Just want to throw that. So. Sorry, Mikey, interrupted as usual.
Well, not every professor is, going to reach every student as equally.
Well, I think actually, just to kind of add further to that, that is a fairly kind of common trope amongst people who've been involved in war. I mean, there was a thing, reading accounts from people serving in the Second World War who'd had maybe fathers who'd fought in the First World War, and they say, well, actually my father would never talk about it. And similarly, when you had the kind of like 60s and 70s generation with their fathers having served in the Second World War, and they said, well, we'd say, what did you do in the war, Dad? And he just would not say a word. And I think that's, fortunately for us in Europe, we've been spared, the reality of war for generations now. But, it shouldn't be kind of underestimated, the awfulness.
All that being said, he's a very good raconteur. Like he might have waited a long time, but he took a fish to water when he started.
I mean, he's so urbane, isn't he? I mean, he's very, very well dressed in a slightly kind of raffish style. He obviously, there was very early on in the documentary, they make this point that kind of, said without even consulting his watch at 5 o'clock, it would be like, oh, so it's time that we have a drink, I think.
And he says, 40 years I live in America, still this Polish accent, I cannot lose it.
He said, I speak French, I speak Spanish, I speak Russian, I speak English, and still with the Polish accent.
Actually, going back to that, just to mention one of his spy-like adventures when he had to get through occupied France, he spoke French quite well.
That was a brilliant story.
But with an accent, but he needed, he knew that if he spoke French out loud, people would notice that. So he actually went to a dentist that he could trust and asked him, do something, to puff up, swell up my face so it looks like I have an aching tooth. And, this dentist helped him, inject him with something. So when he got on the train, and, and people were speaking with him, like, do you have your ticket? So he could say in French, oh, ticket. So anybody would explain his, say, mispronunciations having to do with, he has a toothache.
Perfect cover. Yeah.
Exactly. And he was able to cross the country that way. And it was just, one of those many fascinating stories he had to convey about his life in occupied Europe.
Let's rewind just a little bit earlier in the war. So because of his background, because of his skills, because of his contacts, he's approached by people in the underground, approached by people in the Polish government in exile to help document what's going on in Nazi-occupied Poland. And among other things, this is just unbelievable. Among other things, guys, he essentially breaks into the Warsaw Ghetto, not once but twice, sees these awful things. Again, they're all represented very graphically in the documentary. Comes out, guys, he makes it to London, gets an audience with very senior members of the Western Allies. He thinks he's going to convince them about everything that's going on. But he's basically shocked at the reception that he gets in London. Tell us what happened then.
And just to go before that as well, he's very keen to straighten a few things out in this documentary. Like you said at the start, it's a mixture of source materials. These interviews have been seen before, and there's obviously a few things he wants to correct. And one of the first things he mentions is, prior to the Warsaw Ghetto meeting, his task had been more to take a general on-the-ground picture of the reaction and the situation of the Jewish community. And he's quite critical, actually, of the fact that, as he describes it, many of the Polish peasants are not too sympathetic to the situation. And the Home Army's representatives in the government in exile ask him to take that piece out of the report. And,
politics come into play, basically.
He's a very fair-minded man. That's what keeps coming into me. This is a guy who wants this story to be told accurately, and I'm not sure what his beef was with the Shoab thing, but there's a clear vibe in these interviews that he wants to make sure this is the definitive version as well. So I just wanted to note that. And it's unbelievable, really. I mean, the reaction to his discoveries
in London
is extraordinary, because he's expecting, the kind of shock and horror he felt seeing these things to be reflected in the reaction, and eventually, of course, it is. And there are reports put out, we'll get to that as well. Like, they put out the first basically written report of the Holocaust, which is all based on his eyewitness testimony.
Well, he has this idea that he wants all the allies to kind of like sign a declaration and publicise it, which is to saying, like, we know what you're doing in Germany, and if you continue to do this, then we will bomb you without quarter, because this is not just about war. This is a crime against humanity. And actually, the Allied leaders are initially very, very reluctant to get on board with this declaration. It's like, well, we do this for the Jews. And okay, maybe I'm leaping ahead a little bit to.
Well, we might as well discuss the reaction now.
Right.
We might as well jump around and discuss the overall reaction.
But before we get to FDR and DC, though, I was struck by the fact that I've forgotten exactly who it was in London. One of the
Anthony Eden, I think.
Was it Eden? They were cool to this idea about this ultimatum to Germany.
About was pissing off Stalin, though. That was his number one kind of concern.
They said, well, okay, what you're saying may be true, but what about the Dutch? What about the we're all suffering. In other words, why do we want to put a spotlight on the suffering of the Jews? That was basically the thrust of the response in London. Maybe they were saying this thing without full knowledge of exactly what was going on. They didn't understand the systematic nature, I guess, of the campaign against the Jews. But I think Karski, and I'm sure people in the Polish government and the underground, were shocked and disappointed, to say the least, that they did not get anything like the reception they expected.
And then he went back and got even more evidence, because he linked in with the Jewish underground resistance when he was in London, and sat down, and famously, wasn't it, the Jewish guy says, I'm not saying I don't believe you. I'm just saying I can't.
Yes.
Well, that's Felix Frankfurter, the Supreme Court Justice in America. Yeah.
Very poignant moment. Sorry, so we're I'd say nearly inevitable we'll confuse one or two things here. So I reckon we just bull in and finish off the reaction and some of the maybe things that were.
Let me just say this quickly. I believe it was through the American the Polish government in exile, their embassy in America. Karski got an audience with FDR in the White House.
And this was after he'd actually broken successfully posing as an Estonian prison guard. He went back across Europe.
Just
into one of the death camp holding centers,
story after another,
and actually witnessed it. Because, like you said, the first reaction, it was nearly like you hadn't gathered enough evidence.
He's been in the Warsaw Ghetto twice, and they gave the name of the document. I didn't recognize it. It wasn't one of the major extermination camps like Auschwitz or Majdanek.
Well, it was a transit camp. It was where they were shipping people off to the death camp.
No, they were showing mothers having their babies torn from them and thrown into like another train.
It was the transit place for Belzec, which is near Lublin.
So he gets this audience with FDR, lays it all out, and FDR,
and this is later in 43.
The aristocrat and hero of the working class somehow. He gives this very kind of, I don't know,
magisterial.
Yes, like, oh, don't worry, we're going to win the war. Kind of the same answer he gave to everybody who came to him with the problem. Yeah. Exactly. Wasn't exactly encouraging, wasn't exactly sympathetic. Reasons for that are up for debate. Maybe he didn't want to, in the documentary they mentioned he didn't want to maybe seem overly enthusiastic about
Karski's extraordinarily
fighting for the Jews.
About this encounter.
Oh, yeah.
And there he was, Lord of Humanity.
Yeah, that's where the title of the documentary comes from, FDR's response and his phrase. And so he didn't say it, but that's how he acted. Yeah, that's right.
What do you think of this theory, which I read after I watched the documentary, that FDR, because he was so criticised for wanting to bring the US into the war, he was seen as the non-isolationist, we wanted to get involved, that he was extremely sensitive to the inevitable accusation that the worldwide Jewish cabal were pulling his strings. Well, that was a real thing back then.
I'm confused by the timeline here, because this is
a lot of anti-Semitism in the US as well.
This is 43, almost 2 years after America was in the war. After Pearl Harbor, of course, first boots on the ground. I think in the late spring, early summer of 42. So why in 43 are we worried about getting entangled in this?
Roosevelt felt if he made a big special statement about the Jewish situation, that it would prove prove to some of the right-wing press in America that all the way along the Jews have been pulling the string to get them involved. You know, that type of anti-Semitism was ugly. It was mainstream at the time. You know, it's just
Mike, doesn't this story we're talking about with FDR and maybe Karski's whole experience feed into the very well-established Polish theme, kind of the self-impression of the friend that's been abandoned by powerful allies?
Well, yeah, this is definitely something that Poland has felt, you know, in the national conscience for a while, that their allies, especially on the Western side, basically abandoned Poland, you know, before the war, during the war, and then after the war. And they felt that, you know, that they were basically sold out to the Germans and then to the Soviets later on. And there is something to it. You know, Poland was seen as just like another pawn, another country to be, you know, dealt with and split between whatever power structure exists after the war. And this this interview that Karski gives in his talk about what happened during his meeting with Roosevelt kind of seems, you know, play into that.
Mm-hmm. But also it is important to note the real politic at the end of World War II, in that the Russians were on the ground, millions of troops dying. In some sense, by that stage, Stalin was calling the shots, and there's no doubt Poland got absolutely screwed at the end of it. But you know, at the same time, Roosevelt was making calculations on a global scale. So I'm sure that's what he'd tell you. You know?
I mean, but that, you know, just because he was making calculations, it's still true that in that case he sold out Poland, in a sense, like he realized, like, oh, the calculation is that, you know, we earn more by selling them out to Stalin than, you know, trying to back them up. So, you know, Poles in that sense have a right to feel a little bit sold out.
Absolutely,
they were.
Absolutely.
I mean, you had like other allies, like Churchill was a lot more opposed to Stalin, but at that time the British Empire,
he was the junior player.
We just really didn't have the pull. They didn't have the.
Before we wrap
anymore.
this up, I want to open a small tangent. Let's not let this go too far, but a couple of things. First of all, watching this, and Josh, you may have had the same reaction because you and I have talked about this before, I think. Watching this documentary, I was constantly reminded of a documentary series called World at War from the 1970s, which is, if you don't know, it is still, even today, it is the gold standard of World War II documentaries. And the reason I was reminded of it is that, in Karski, we had someone who was there, a witness. And the World at War series is just an endless sequence of people who were there, from a leadership position to the infantry soldier position to, many, many different aspects of the war. And we don't have that today. Here we are 80 years after the war. We simply don't have people who were there who can give firsthand accounts. And not only from the graininess of the film, Karski's interview, but just the idea that we were hearing from somebody directly from it reminded me quite a lot of that, again, World at War. Does that make sense to you?
No, absolutely. I mean, I'm kind of...
This covers a bit that World at War I totally ignored.
Well, I'm slightly kind of embarrassed to admit that I've never seen the World at War.
Very good.
Well, in fact, thanks to the miracle of the internet, I have the entirety of it, and I shall...
It's like 60 hours, but it is the best.
No, it's not that much, but it's like 30 hours, I think. 26.
Well, there's like extra episodes that didn't. Okay, let's agree to disagree. Anyway, it's long.
But there was I recently read an article about it, and one of the things that's fascinating, it was broadcast like 1973, 1970.
Yeah.
I was just basically it was my bedtime, so it was not stuff for a kid of my age to be watching. But what's fantastic about it is not just the Allied perspective, but they were also, Albert Speer is interviewed, like the General Wolf.
Right, very senior people. Yes.
People who'd done their time after Nuremberg and everything. So you were getting, and I mean, it's chilling, really.
It is. So
and just to say as well, just because you reminded me of something, how difficult it was to negotiate with Stalin at the end of the war. Nuremberg is a great example. The trouble that caused, just to have those trials, that limited amount of justice. And actually Katyn, as we've covered before on the show, which, by the way, another thing, we're never going to recount everything Karski did anyway, but he was supposed to be sent to Katyn and only got away with it because he changed uniforms and got confused with a lower ranking officer. It's an amazing story. If we try to tell everything, we just mess it up anyway. But I mean, Nuremberg's a good example of how much everything is true what we're saying. Like Churchill famously said to Roosevelt, we started this bloody war over Poland. You can't honestly tell me we're just going to give them up to a totalitarian regime. And he just looked at him and he said, well, what do you want to do? Start World War III? And that's how it was seen by the real politics in the corridors of power. And I have some sympathy for that. It's just Poland was the major victim of that thinking.
The other thing I wanted to bring up was that this Karski story kind of gives us a window into a very interesting kind of subchapter of World War II, which has always been interesting to me. The debate goes on to this day. What did the Allies know when we're talking about the Holocaust in places like Auschwitz and Belzec, Sobibor, Majdanek, etc.? What did the Allies know? When did they know it? And what did they do about it? Because a lot of people would suggest that maybe for whatever selfish reasons they chose not to act. And again, the debate goes on to this day, but I find it interesting because people often don't point out that the strategic kind of the situation on the map, so to speak, was very much against the Allies. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that Churchill and Roosevelt and Stalin wouldn't give a shit if he knew what was going on at Auschwitz. But let's say Washington, D.C. and London knew perfectly well what was going on in, let's say, 1943. They had photographs, stories from people who had escaped, et cetera, and they believed them. Well, the question then becomes, what are they supposed to do, right? These places on the map were hundreds, oftentimes thousands of miles, kilometers behind enemy lines, well beyond the reach of their bombers. Stalin could have made it. Stalin had closer airports, but he wasn't going to help. And even if it was with it, because the point is you can't send soldiers on the ground. And even if they could reach it with bombers, what are they supposed to do? Bomb Auschwitz?
Well, that's kind of what I was driving at in my slight sympathy for Roosevelt's realpolitik position. But as Josh said earlier in the piece, Karski and the government came up with a very clear thing. They said, look, let's threaten the Germans in terms of bomb and raid tactics and see if we can get them to back off this. See if we can say to them, look, we know you're doing this. Stop it.
And the answer was we're fighting a broader war already.
And what gave Karski some hope that the Germans might react to that is that they were covering up the Holocaust. Let's not forget that. This is a very important point sometimes people forget. The plan for the Nazi regime was to have a kind of don't ask, don't tell policy about the Jewish situation at the end of the war that they obviously thought they were going to win. So it wasn't something that they were loudly talking about. It was like, we're transporting them. Well, what does that mean? Shh, leave us alone.
We're relocating them.
Yeah,
exactly.
So anyway, one thing that's good, we haven't tried to recount most of the major events in the documentary, and I think we'd be on a hiding to nothing if we did. It's that fascinating a story that for once the KrakCast can just wholeheartedly, all four of us in agreement.
Yeah, no doubt about it.
I'm sure we could find something to argue about if we really wanted. Can recommend you spend an hour and 10 minutes watching this. We're about to review a Polish movie where that's very much not the case.
That's next episode. And
that's the next episode.
But yeah, if you've got Netflix, especially if you live here, you've got to watch this. Just over an hour of your time. As I said, everything's in English, Polish subtitles. So you owe it to yourself to watch Karski Władca Ludzkości.
I should be careful what I say. Not really. She literally never listened to an episode. But my wife wouldn't be massively into political history documentaries. And she was absolutely loving this. It's so well done, really is.
And I think I really recommend that, if anybody listening to us should definitely watch this. And afterwards, when everything's over and we can go outside and go to a bar or anywhere, we should all order a nice Manhattan and toast Karski.
That's right.
The Manhattan.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, we really haven't even scratched the surface of what happens in the doc. Seriously, get on it.
Thanks for listening, everybody. KrakCast.pl, all of our back episodes. Almost 300 episodes now.
He even sounds like he was awesome at being an alcoholic.
Check it out. And we'll catch you next time on the KrakCast.